Yɛresiesie and the Preparation for Reparations podcast, episode 7, part 2. No reparations without liberation. Building MAATUBUNTUMAN as the foundation for UBUNTUDUNIA. Welcome back to Yɛresiesie and the Preparation for Reparations podcast. I'm your host, Esther Xosei, joined once again by my co-host, Brother Simeon. As always, let us first pour libations. We pour libation to the Creator of the heavens and the earth, to our African ancestors and ancestresses who guide our path towards liberation, to the visionaries who see beyond the Western-dominated world order to a multipolar future, to the revolutionary women leaders whose contributions have been systematically erased, to the unnamed masses, the market women who organized resistance, the farmers who fed revolutionary armies, and the ordinary people who risk everything to shelter our freedom fighters, to the youth who continue to rise up in the face of repression, the elders who pass down knowledge of resistance, and the workers whose labor sustains our movements, to the communities worldwide building alternatives to neo-colonial domination through their daily acts of courage and commitment. May our words honor their sacrifices. May our actions manifest their visions. Ashe, Ashe, Asheo.
Greetings, family. In part 1 of this episode, we explored the alliance of the Sahel states, demonstrating the principles that liberation is the necessary foundation for reparatory justice. We examined how their actions to reclaim sovereignty over resources, territories, and political systems represent applied reparations through people's power.
Yes. And we discussed how these movements are working to stop the continuation of the structural and epistemic violence perpetuated by the imposition of artificial borders instituted after the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference. What the Alliance of Sahel States shows us is the concrete process of stopping those aspects of the Maangamizi that continue to fragment African people and territories while extracting our resources. Now, in part 2, we'll expand our lens to examine how these popular movements for sovereignty contribute to a broader global transformation, the building of MAATUBUNTUMAN, the Pan-Afrikan Union of Communities, as the foundation for UBUNTUDUNIA, that is an anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice. What the Alliance of Sahel States demonstrates is that we cannot build a repaired world, which is UBUNTUDUNIA, without first repairing Afrika, which is MAATUBUNTUMAN. These aren't just theoretical visions. Their concrete building blocks are being assembled right now through people's struggles for African sovereignty and self-determination.
This continues our exploration of how preparation for reparations, Yɛresiesie and involves not just organizing within existing systems, but contributing to the transformation of the global order itself through people's power, with an understanding that MAATUBUNTUMAN must be established as the foundation of UBUNTUDUNIA.
Exactly. Today we'll be examining how Pan-Africanism has always been fundamentally a movement of people rather than states. This distinction is crucial for understanding both the grassroots movements that are now challenging the Berlin Conference borders and the larger vision they embody. The Alliance of Sahel States represents a governmental manifestation of these popular movements, but the true driving force comes from our African heritage communities who have never fully accepted these artificial divisions. While these governments play a role, the organised power of ordinary people across the continent and throughout the diaspora continues to be the primary catalyst for transformation. We'll also provide concrete action steps for how you, our listeners, can participate in this ongoing process.
Pan-Africanism and the multipolar world. I've been reflecting on how the people's movements for sovereignty in the Sahel are part of a broader global transformation. There seems to be a significant connection between the renaissance of Pan-Africanism we're witnessing and the active building of MAATUBUNTUMAN, the Pan-Afrikan Union of Communities, which is the necessary foundation for UBUNTUDUNIA, the imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice. What's particularly striking is how the Alliance of Sahel States leaders, Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso, Colonel Assimi Goïta in Mali, and General Abdurrahman Tiani in Niger, are directly challenging artificial borders imposed by the 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference, which have perpetuated structural violence and fragmentation for over a century. These movements embody the Akan principle of Sankofa, symbolized by the mythical bird looking backwards while carrying a golden egg of knowledge forward. Just as the Sankofa bird retrieves the wisdom of past to inform the future, these movements are reclaiming pre-colonial governance models and knowledge systems that existed before the artificial partitioning of Africa. What we're witnessing in the Sahel is the concrete process of repairing Africa as the essential first step in repairing the world.
That's a crucial observation, Brother Simeon. What we're witnessing in the Sahel isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a worldwide movement of peoples towards deep decolonization. From our Pan-African perspective, we see these movements as actively constructing MAATUBUNTUMAN, the Pan-Afrikan Union of Communities. The Confederation of Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger represent a direct challenge to the artificial borders drawn by European powers at the Berlin Conference, borders that have facilitated resource extraction and political domination for generations. By creating new regional formations that transcend these colonial boundaries, the Alliance is stopping key aspects of the continuing MAANGAMIZI, the epistemic and structural violence of imposed borders and fragmentation. This process of repairing Africa is essential before we can achieve UBUNTUDUNIA, the anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice. Because we cannot build a repaired world without first repairing Africa. While not everyone globally shares or even understands this African cosmovision yet, our work as scholar activists involves connecting these diverse struggles to this framework that gives equal attention to both repairing Africa through the establishing of MAATUBUNTUMAN and repairing the world through forming UBUNTUDUNIA in catalyzing other people's reparations and revolutionary struggles for decolonization. The Alliance of Sahel States isn't just theorizing this new world. They're building concrete elements of MAATUBUNTUMAN through actions like resource nationalization, regional integration, and rejecting neo-colonial currencies. Our challenge is to help other reparations and liberation movements worldwide recognize how their own struggles contribute to this dual vision of repairing both Africa and the world.
I think that it's important to emphasize how this framework connects struggles of diaspora and continental Africans through complementary structures. Could you explain more how MAATUBUNTUJAMAs in the diaspora work in conjunction with the continental Sankofa Homes?
This is a critical aspect of our holistic approach to Pan-African reparations and liberation. The MAATUBUNTUJAMAs concept we're developing in the diaspora are models of non-territorial autonomy premised on autonomous community institution building, resource exchange, and service provision. These serve as our diaspora basis for reparatory justice work, while the continental Sankofa Homes, of which the Alliance of Sahel States represents emerging examples, provide liberated territories on the continent of Africa where African sovereignty is being restored. Together, these complementary structures form the building blocks of the emerging MAATUBUNTUMAN, working across the artificial divisions created by both the continental African borders and the forced dispersal of African people. The MAATUBUNTUJAMAs in the diaspora strengthen the Sankofa Homes through material solidarity, political advocacy, and knowledge exchange, while the Sankofa Homes provide the MAATUBUNTUJAMAs with concrete examples of applied sovereignty and self-determination that inspire our work in the diaspora and which we can connect to.
What we're seeing here connects directly to what various Global South scholar activists have described as fundamental shifts in global relations. Organic intellectuals, grassroots activists, and movement leaders from formerly colonized regions have long argued that a post-Western world is inevitable as the artificial dominance of Europe and North America gives way to a more balanced global order. In our Pan-African context, how would you say Pan-Africanism specifically contributes to this multipolar vision?
Pan-Africanism has always offered an alternative to Western universalism. A vision of Africa as a distinct civilizational pole with her own philosophical traditions, social practices, and political models. What's happening now in the Sahel is the practical manifestation of this vision, African societies asserting their right to determine their own future outside of Eurocentric frameworks.
And I think what's particularly striking about this moment is that we're seeing multiple movements towards pluriversality emerging simultaneously. From the BRICS expansion to Latin American integration efforts to the resurgence of indigenous movements, all are challenging the Western universal model and asserting their right to exist on their own terms. The Alliance of Sahel States seems to be Africa's contribution to this broader pluriversal transformation.
Precisely. This is why Western powers have responded with so much hostility to the Alliance of Sahel States, not just because of specific interests in those countries, but because these movements represent a fundamental challenge to the Western-dominated world system based on Eurocentricity. When the alliance leaders collectively nationalize resources, expel foreign military forces, or create new regional economic frameworks, they're not just addressing local or even national issues, but contributing to a global transformation towards a multipolar world where diverse civilizational centers exist in relation to each other through mutual respect rather than domination and subjugation.
The Stop the Maangamizi campaign has developed the concept of UBUNTUDUNIA to describe this alternative vision. I find this concept particularly powerful because it doesn't reject Western domination, but offers a constructive alternative grounded in African philosophical traditions. Could you share more about how these concepts connect to what we're seeing going on in the Sahel?
UBUNTUDUNIA combines Ubuntu from the Nguni languages, the African philosophy emphasizing our interconnectedness and mutual becoming or flourishing, with dunia, the Kiswahili word for world. Together they form a concept meaning a multipolar world of global justice. And we also add to that an anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice. This represents a vision of a world shaped by principles of reciprocity, mutual recognition, flourishing and interconnection, rather than the extractive and hierarchical principles of Western modernity. At its centre is MAATUBUNTUMAN, a name coined from the conjunction of Ma'at, the holistic justice concept from Kemet or ancient Egypt, with Ubuntu, the Bantu concept of the communion of humanity from southern Africa, and Oman, the Akan concept of egalitarianism and an egalitarian polity from West Africa. MAATUBUNTUMAN represents the envisaged future Pan-Afrikan Union of Communities, that is, evolving the current African Union, which maintains the borders of the 1884-1885 conference, to a borderless Africa that actually is premised on indigenous African ethnicities and nationalities. And this Africa is an organic embodiment of Ma'at and therefore practices Ubuntu in relation to her citizens and the entirety of humanity, Mother Earth and the Pluriverse.
What I find particularly valuable about this conceptual framework is that it avoids two common pitfalls in discussions of alternatives to Western hegemony. On one hand, it's not simply reactive anti-Westernism that defines itself purely in opposition. On the other hand, it doesn't advocate for a return to some imagined pre-colonial purity that ignores centuries of global interconnection. Instead, it offers a forward-looking vision grounded in African philosophical traditions, but engaged with contemporary global realities, a true pluriversal approach.
That's an excellent point, Brother Simeon. UBUNTUDUNIA isn't about rejecting all aspects of Western or European civilization or returning to some imagined pre-colonial purity. It's about creating a world of pluriversality where no single civilization's model is imposed as universal, where genuine dialogue between different knowledge systems and governance models becomes possible. It recognizes both the distinctiveness of different civilizational centers and their profound interconnection within a pluriversal global order. It is actually a world where many worlds fit, as the Zapatistas say.
In my political work with various Pan-African formations, I've noticed that people often struggle to imagine alternatives to the current global system. The concept of MAATUBUNTUMAN within UBUNTUDUNIA offers a concrete vision that helps people see beyond present limitations. Are there specific examples of how the Alliance of Sahel States is contributing to this multipolar vision beyond their actions within their own territories?
Yes, their approach to international relations exemplifies this multipolar vision. They're developing partnerships with countries like Russia and other global South nations based on practical respect for sovereignty rather than ideological alignment. They're showing interest in initiatives like the BRICS that aim to create alternative economic structures outside Western control, and they're articulating a vision of international relations based on mutual benefit rather than domination, challenging the rules-based order that in practice means rules created by and for Western powers.
This reminds me of what Samir Amin called delinking, not complete economic independence or isolation, but selective engagement with global systems on terms that prioritize internal needs over external demands. The Alliance seems to be implementing this approach in practice by maintaining international connections but reorganizing them to serve African interests first.
Absolutely. What makes this moment so significant is that multiple challenges to Western universalism are emerging simultaneously across the globe, from the Alliance of Sahel States in Africa, to BRICS in the global economic sphere, to indigenous resurgence movements and indigenous sovereignty movements in the so-called Americas or Abya-Yala. All are rejecting the premise that Western modernity represents the universal path of human progress. Instead, they're demonstrating that pluriversality is not just possible, but necessary for addressing the converging crisis or polycrisis facing humanity.
And importantly, these aren't just protests against the existing order, but practical efforts to create alternatives. In my conversations with younger activists, I've observed growing interest in concrete examples of alternatives rather than just critiques. The actual practices being developed in the Sahel at the moment provide those tangible models.
That's the crucial point. What distinguishes this moment from earlier anti-colonial movements is the focus on building concrete alternatives rather than simply demanding inclusion in existing structures that were created without us. The Alliance of Sahel States isn't asking for better terms within French neo-colonial frameworks. They're creating entirely different economic, political, and security arrangements. This constructive dimension is what makes these movements so powerful and threatening to the existing order.
And how does this connect to our understanding of reparations as both material redistribution and structural transformation? I've always felt that reparations demands that don't address the underlying global structures risk being incorporated into those structures without fundamental change.
It demonstrates that genuine reparations cannot occur within the existing global order. It requires transforming that order, which is the world, itself. If the colonial relationship continues in new forms, even significant financial transfers won't constitute genuine or full repair. What the Alliance of Sahel States shows us is that reparatory justice requires both material redistribution and the creation of new global structures that eliminate the possibility of ongoing harm through domination. This is what distinguishes transformative reparations from reformist approaches that leave fundamental power imbalances intact.
Diaspora and continental unity in building global alternatives. It seems to me that this connects to the critical question of what forms of governance might emerge in a post-liberal world. The current backlash against Western-style democracy isn't happening in Africa, but globally. Yet many Western observers can only interpret any deviation from their model as authoritarianism rather than recognizing the legitimate critique of liberal democracy's limitations and failures.
Exactly. Liberal democracy, or should I say Western liberal democracy, as conceived in the global north, emerged from specific historical and material conditions that simply do not exist in most parts of the world. It's premised on the existence of a wealthy middle class, racial and ethnic homogeneity, or at least the fiction of it, and resources extracted from elsewhere to maintain social peace and progress at home. None of these conditions apply in most of the global south, which is why imposed liberal democratic systems so often fail or become empty procedural exercises that don't address fundamental needs of the masses.
And what's particularly noteworthy about the Sahel movements is that they're not simply rejecting democracy as a concept, but challenging its Western foundation. They're asking the fundamental question: what would governance that genuinely reflects African values, traditions, and material conditions look like?
Precisely. This is about reclaiming the right to determine not just who governs, but how governance itself is structured. The Sahel movements are creating space to draw from both pre-colonial African political traditions, many of which included sophisticated systems of checks and balances, popular participation of the peoples, and leader accountability and contemporary needs. Rather than importing a system designed for different contexts, they're exploring what a genuinely African approach to governance might entail.
I've noticed that Western media consistently frames any rejection of their governance models as a move towards authoritarianism rather than recognizing it as potentially as a move towards authentic forms of popular sovereignty. This framing serves to delegitimize any alternative to Western liberal democracy.
It's a profound form of epistemic violence. The West positions its particular governance model as universal, labeling all alternatives as deviations from the norm, rather than potentially valid approaches with their own internal logic. This effectively denies other peoples and societies the right to political self-determination, to determine not just who governs, but what the very framework of governance itself is or should be. The courage of the Sahel movements lies in their willingness to challenge this epistemic dominance and assert their right to political experimentation beyond Eurocentric models.
Let's talk about how diaspora communities can connect with and contribute to the sovereignty movements as part of building global alternatives to the Western-dominated world order.
This is a crucial question because the original harms of African chattel enslavement and colonization was precisely the fragmentation of African identity and community, separating us from each other and from our relationships with our ancestral lands. True repair requires healing this fragmentation by building direct relationships between diaspora communities and continental sovereignty movements, creating pathways for the flow of resources, knowledges, and political power.
And how might the concept of UBUNTUDUNIA with MAATUBUNTUMAN as its center inform these diaspora continental relationships?
MAATUBUNTUMAN as the emerging Pan-Afrikan Union of Communities within the multipolar world of global justice, that is UBUNTUDUNIA, offers a powerful framework for these relationships. It emphasizes both distinctiveness and interconnection by bringing together three profound African notions: Ma'at, which is holistic justice; Ubuntu, which is communion of humanity; and Oman, an egalitarian polity. This framework recognizes that diaspora and continental communities have developed different knowledge, strategies, and priorities due to their specific contexts and realities, while affirming their fundamental connection as parts of one global African family. MAATUBUNTUMAN provides the conceptual and practical basis for these relationships, a vision of African society rooted in justice, balance, reciprocity that connects continental and diaspora struggles within one unified framework. As an organic embodiment of Ma'at that practices Ubuntu, MAATUBUNTUMAN offers principles for how we relate not only to each other within the global African family, but also to the entirety of humanity, Mother Earth, Nana Asaseya, and the Pluriverse.
And what concrete forms might these diaspora continental relationships take in practice?
Well, several models are emerging. First, direct resource sharing and participation, where diaspora communities organize through Ma'atubuntu Jamas, which is non-territorial autonomy, Pan-African communities that are repairing themselves, contribute to and participate in African-owned and led enterprises aligned with sovereignty principles within the continental-based Sankofa Homes. Second, knowledge exchange programs where expertise flows in both directions between diaspora formations and liberated zones on the continent, otherwise known as the Sankofa Homes, which is how we see the Alliance of Sahel States. Third, political solidarity networks where diaspora communities challenge governments in the diaspora and their policies that undermine African sovereignty and the development of more Sankofa Homes. Because to even develop Sankofa Homes, that is often considered treasonous. Look at the reaction of ECOWAS to the declaration of the Alliance of Sahel States. And fourth, cultural revival initiatives that strengthen shared identity and values across the global African family. These aren't relationships of external investment. They reflect the fundamental right of diaspora Africans to belong to and share in the struggles being waged in defense of our homeland. As the powerful slogan of the Alliance of Sahel States declares, homeland or death. And actually the earlier slogan coming out of the Haitian or Haitian Revolution was liberty or death. And this is a commitment that resonates with diaspora communities who understand that our liberation is inseparable from the defense and sovereignty of Mama Africa.
The political solidarity dimension seems particularly important given Western hostility to movements like the Alliance of Sahel States.
Absolutely. Diaspora communities occupy a strategic position for challenging Western and Eurocentric narratives and policies that undermine African people's sovereignty. When UK-based communities organise to oppose economic pressures, diplomatic isolation, and threats of military interventions against the alliance of Sahel state countries, or challenge media misrepresentations that delegitimise the movements that are operating there as mere coups, they're providing crucial political support that directly impacts continental struggles.
And this connects to our understanding of reparations as a process that addresses both historical harm and its contemporary manifestations.
Precisely. These diaspora continental relationships represent reparations in practice, or applied reparations, healing the fragmentation caused by African chattel enslavement and colonization, while simultaneously challenging the systems that continue to extract wealth and undermine African people's sovereignty today. They demonstrate that reparations isn't just about addressing the past, but transforming present relationships to create different futures.
And how does this approach differ from conventional development or humanitarian frameworks?
It differs fundamentally because it's based on solidarity and mutual transformation, and dare I say, revolution, the African revolution and continuance of it, rather than charity or so-called expertise transfer, which typically means imposing Eurocentric knowledges while devaluing African knowledge systems. Conventional development frameworks maintain the hierarchy between so-called developed and developing regions, positioning Africa as perpetually behind and in need of Western tutelage and expertise, including of those of us of African heritage and ancestry that live or operate in the global north. The solidarity relationships we're discussing recognize the wisdom, agency, dignity, and leadership of African heritage communities of resistance and their movements, with resources flowing based on shared struggle and the recognition of historical responsibility for effecting and securing holistic reparative justice, rather than just from a place of patronizing pity.
And from our diaspora perspective, what specific movements or initiatives on the continent should we be connecting with and supporting?
Well, beyond the Alliance of Sahel States that we focused on in this episode, several other movements deserve attention and solidarity. There is the Pan-Afrikan Federalist movement, which is working to advance continental unity beyond the limitations of the current African Union. Various reparations movements across Africa are articulating continental demands for accountability and redress from former and continuing colonial powers. We must also support people's liberation movements that are seeking to re-establish sovereignty when it comes to land, resources, and our institutions that continue to be controlled by external powers and their local collaborators and fifth columnists. And numerous community-based initiatives for food sovereignty, cooperative economics, and cultural revival are creating alternatives to neo-colonial maldevelopment models across Africa.
So the task of the diaspora communities is to develop relationships with these movements that strengthen both continental sovereignty and diaspora liberation struggles.
Exactly. And importantly, these relationships should be developed through direct engagement rather than Western mediated channels. when diaspora communities rely on Western media, academic institutions, or NGOs for their understanding of continental realities, they often receive distorted information filtered through colonial perspectives. Building direct relationships through delegation exchanges, independent media platforms, and diaspora organizations with continental connections, connecting into communities of resistance, allows for authentic solidarity based on genuine and mutual understanding, or should I say, overstanding.
Preparing for MAATUBUNTUMAN, concrete actions. Let's now focus on concrete actions our listeners can take to support these movements and participate in building global alternatives. How can people prepare themselves to embody Yɛresiesie, becoming the reparatory justice change they wish to see?
This is where we bring our conversation back to the central theme of this podcast. Yɛresiesie doesn't just mean abstractly preparing for reparations in a way that we're sitting waiting to receive something. It means actively embodying reparatory justice in our present actions, our structures, our relationships, our thought processes even. Preparation isn't waiting. It's doing the work right now to bring our vision into concrete reality, starting with ourselves, our families, and our communities.
So what specific steps can listeners take to prepare themselves and their communities?
I'd like to outline 6 key action areas that emerge from our analysis of the Alliance of Sahel States and the broader shift towards a multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice. That is, an anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice that we refer to as UBUNTUDUNIA. These aren't exhaustive, but they provide a framework for engaging with this transformative and revolutionary process.
Okay, let's start with the first action area.
So the first action area is study and analysis. Establish or join a ma'at, so as a juror, in your community where you can study these sovereignty movements and develop collective analysis of how they connect to your own local context. You can use our guide from episode 2 of this podcast to help you set this up. This study shouldn't just focus on news events, but should examine the deeper principles and strategies these movements are employing. And we like to emphasize the importance of action learning, that is, learning through doing.
And beyond study, there are material solidarity actions, correct?
Yes, the second action area is material solidarity. Develop concrete initiatives with sovereignty movements in the Sahel and elsewhere on the continent. This can include supporting African-owned and led businesses, cooperatives in these countries, contributing to solidarity funds for specific, alternative progression or so-called development projects, and organising delegations to build direct relationships with communities there. The key principle is that resources should flow based on solidarity, mutuality, and shared struggle, rather than charity or guilt.
The third area would involve political advocacy in our local contexts.
Yes. The third action area is political intervention. Challenge your government's policies or the policies of the government where you live, especially those that undermine African sovereignty, from military interventions and economic sanctions to unfair trade agreements and support for corrupt regimes. In the UK, use the Stop the MAANGAMIZI campaign's MP template letter available on our website to demand that your representative support policies that respect African self-determination and reparations. This political intervention is crucial for removing external obstacles to continental sovereignty movements.
And there's also cultural work to be done, isn't there?
Yes, the fourth area of action is cultural resistance and revitalization. Challenge colonial narratives about Africa in the media and education by organizing community education events, supporting Pan-African artists and cultural workers, and practicing African cultural traditions in your own community. The cultural dimension of reparations is essential to healing from the psychological wounds of the Maangamizi and building the shared identity necessary for coordinated global action.
And do these four areas connect to the institutional infrastructure needed to coordinate these efforts?
Yes, that's our fifth action area, building organizational infrastructure. So, for instance, you can attend or organize a Pan-African Reparations Rebellion groundings in your area. You can, these groundings then evolve into Pan-African People's Assemblies or Pan-African Assemblies on African Reparations. You can connect with the various types of federalist movements. You know, there are various online forums and local chapters. You can support the development of the sixth region framework that is recognized by the African Union, so that we in the diaspora are recognized as being the sixth region of Africa. So there's organizing happening across the UK, across Europe, across other parts of the diaspora. We can be getting involved with these and from a critical standpoint to engage with processes that the African Union is championing, but doing so from the perspective of critical engagement. These structures help coordinate our diverse efforts into a cohesive global movement that can effectively challenge neo-colonial systems while building the alternatives.
And there's also the mental and spiritual preparation needed to properly engage with these movements, isn't there?
Yes, this is crucial. Our sixth action area is the internal preparation necessary for building MAATUBUNTUMAN in UBUNTUDUNIA. This preparation is guided by the Akan principle of Sankofa, literally meaning go back and fetch it, which calls us to reconnect with our historical roots and cultural legacies to address present challenges. Like the mythical Sankofa bird that looks backward while carrying a golden egg of knowledge forward, we must retrieve and repossess African wisdom that was disrupted by centuries of colonization, enslavement, and epistemicide, the killing of our African knowledge systems. The Alliance of Sahel States is a building block towards the vision of MAATUBUNTUMAN within UBUNTUDUNIA. But we must prepare ourselves to participate in and contribute to its development and advancement through this Sankofa approach, using our remembering of the past as a dynamic source for healing, for building collective historical memory, and for rememberment, the process of remembering, putting back together our African heritage communities. This means studying African political thought from various thinkers, scholar activists, intellectuals, revolutionaries such as Osajifo Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, many others whose Pan-Africanist ideologies emphasize the unity and reliance of African people. It means recovering and practicing Ubuntu principles in our daily relationships. And it means decolonizing our consciousness through African-centered spiritual practices and thought systems that reconnect us to the principles of Ma'at.
Could you suggest some starting points for this mental preparation?
Absolutely. We can begin by engaging with foundational Pan-Africanist text by people such as Sheikh Anta Diop, Osajifo Kwame Nkrumah, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, Thomas Sankara. Of course, we mustn't forget the huge contribution made by African women revolutionaries and anti-colonial leaders, nationalist leaders, independence leaders, many of whom may not necessarily have books or may not have written books and may not have books written after them or about them, but whom we now know a lot more about their own contributions, such as the Yasantuas of this world, the Mbuya Nahandas, the Fumilayo Ransome Kutis, the Theodora Gomez, the Winnie Mandelas, and many, many more. And of course, we mustn't forget the contemporary reparations scholar activists that are creating knowledge that we can reflect on. It's important to join or create study circles in your community to collectively analyze these works, their contributions of these leaders and communities in resistance, and also the application of these knowledges to current movements like the Alliance of Sahel States. It's important to develop practices of critical self-reflection that help identify and challenge internalized colonial thought patterns while strengthening African-centered ways of relating to others and the world. And of course, first relating to ourselves. So the Ma'at Zawazajuras that we've discussed provide an excellent framework for this kind of collective study and consciousness development.
These action areas seem interrelated rather than separate initiatives.
They are absolutely interconnected. The study of Ma'at Zawazajuras informs our material solidarity initiatives. Our cultural revival strengthens our capacity for political intervention. Our organizational infrastructure coordinates our diverse efforts, and our internal preparation enables us to engage authentically with all of these dimensions. Together, they represent a holistic approach to preparing ourselves for participation in the creation of the anti-imperialist, multipolar, pluriversal world of global justice that we refer to as Ubuntudunia, with Africa as a sovereign civilizational pole.
And how might listeners prioritize among these action areas based on their specific capacities and contexts?
Different individuals and communities will naturally emphasize different aspects of this work based on their specific strengths, resources, and local conditions. Some might focus on political advocacy because they have access to political systems. Others might emphasize cultural revitalization because they have artistic skills or cultural knowledge. What's important is not that everyone does everything, but that we collectively cover all these dimensions through coordinated action. This is why the organizational infrastructure is so crucial. It allows us to coordinate our varied efforts into a coherent framework.
And ultimately, this preparation isn't just about supporting distant movements, but transforming our own communities as well.
Exactly. The principle of think globally, act locally applies perfectly here. When we establish Ma'at Zawazajuras, practice Ubuntu economics in our communities, challenge colonial narratives in our local contexts, and build organisational infrastructure for coordinated action, we are simultaneously supporting continental sovereignty movements and creating alternatives within our own context. This integration of the local and the global transformation is at the heart of our overstanding of reparations as a comprehensive process of liberation. As we conclude this two-part episode, it's clear that the sovereignty movements in the Sahel represent not just local resistance to neo-colonialism, but a contribution to a profound global transformation. The Alliance of Sahel States is showing us that liberation is the necessary foundation for reparations, while simultaneously participating in the creation of a multipolar world beyond Western hegemony.
And our role as diaspora communities isn't just to observe or analyse these developments, but to actively participate in and contribute to the transformative process through the 6 areas you've outlined. This is a true meaning of Yɛresiesie, preparing ourselves by becoming the reparatory justice change we wish for.
Precisely. Yɛresiesie means we don't wait for external saviours or even perfect conditions. We prepare ourselves by building the structures, relationships, and most importantly, consciousness needed for our liberation in order that we can effect, secure, and take reparations. This is the profound shift that movements in the Sahel represent. They're showing us that reparations isn't something granted as charity by former colonial powers. It's something we secure through organised people's power building and self-determined struggle. For diaspora communities, this means combining strategic demands on Western institutions with active participation in building alternative economic and political structures anchored in... Let me do that last sentence because I think I pronounced it.
You said something about Western. It's Western.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't pronounce it properly,
Yeah.
Okay. For diaspora communities, this means combining strategic demands on Western institutions with active participation in building alternative economic and political structures anchored in African sovereignty.
I'm also struck by how these developments demonstrate the importance of embodying our vision in our present practice, not postponing the world we want to create to some distant future, but bringing elements of it into our present reality through daily actions and organisational forms.
That's a crucial insight, Brother Simeon. Yɛresiesie means we aren't just preparing for some future liberation. We're practicing reparatory justice in the present through how we organise, how we relate to each other, and how we build alternatives to oppressive systems of the Maangamizi. When our Maatsoas operate by consensus rather than domination, when our economic initiatives practice reciprocity rather than extraction, when our political work centres the voices of the most marginalised, we're embodying reparatory justice principles. We're embodying reparatory justice principles right now.
I'm also struck by how these developments are contributing to a broader global transformation, the emergence of a truly multipolar world beyond West hegemony.
That's a crucial observation. The renaissance of Pan-Africanism we're witnessing now isn't happening in isolation. It's part of a worldwide movement towards deep decolonisation. For us as Pan-African reparationists, the Alliance of Sahel States represents liberated zones on the continent, what we call Sankofa Homes, that serve as concrete builder blocks for MAATUBUNTUMAN. These Sankofa homes work organically with the emerging MAATUBUNTUJAMAs we're developing in the diaspora, creating a unified process of Pan-African liberation, community building and nation building that transcends the artificial borders imposed by European colonialism. Following Asajifo Kwame Nkrumah's revolutionary strategy outlined in works like his Handbook of Revolutionary Warfare, we recognize these liberated zones as essential stepping stones towards the building of a repaired Africa. Our task is to catalyze the development of more and more of such liberated zones so that the African revolution can advance towards its logical conclusion, not a Pan-Africanism that preserves colonial borders and merely unites existing states, but one that transforms these borders along the lines of the best interests of Africans both at home and abroad. This is about indigenizing Pan-Africanism, so it focuses on uniting people who transcend these existing borders, both on the continent and in the diaspora. A type of revolutionary intercommunalism, as was promoted by Huey P. Newton. What these movements demonstrate so clearly is that we cannot create a repaired world without first, or at the same time, as repairing Africa. And that repair must be on our own terms, through our own people's power.
So, thank you to all our listeners for joining us for this two-part episode. In our next episode, we'll explore how the Black radical imagination helps us envision and create post-reparations futures that our liberation struggles are making possible.
Until then, we invite you to put these action steps that we have been speaking about into practice as concrete manifestations of Yɛresiesie preparing ourselves by becoming the reparatory justice change that we wish to see in the world. Embrace the Akan principle of Sankofa, reaching back to reclaim and repossess our historical wisdom while moving forward. Like the Sankofa bird carrying its golden egg of knowledge, we must reconnect with our cultural legacies that were disrupted by centuries of colonization and enslavement, using this rememory as a source of healing and collective identity building. Don't wait for others to initiate the change or for perfect conditions to arise. Engage with foundational Pan-African texts. Establish or join the Ma'at Zoazajuras for collective study. Connect with solidarity initiatives and sovereignty movements in the motherland. Use tools like the Stop the Maangamizi MP letter template. Each action you take to study, organise, build alternatives and challenge colonial systems is itself an act of reparatory justice, not just preparation for some future moment, but a practical embodiment of the world that we are prefiguring and creating by our own people's power. Remember that Africa, Mama Africa, is the base from which our global liberation struggle draws its power, inspiration, and legitimacy. The Alliance of Sahel States is showing us one pathway towards building MAATUBUNTUMAN as the Pan-African foundation and heart of UBUNTUDUNIA. And our task is to connect with and build upon these efforts from wherever we are situated. The work of repair begins with you, begins with me, begins with us right now through our daily practices and our collective actions. And through these concrete manifestations of Yɛresiesie and the African Revolution will be completed and we shall win. Ashe! This is Esther Xosei
And Brother Simeon,
on behalf of the MAATUBUNTUMAN Educational Trust, reminding you that when we recognize our struggle as one struggle on many fronts, with Africa as the base, we are practicing Yɛresiesie and we are preparing ourselves for the holistic and full reparatory justice our communities deserve. Thanks to Brother Daniel Kofi, our technical assistants, for all of your support today.